What's up guys, Vylocity from Pitchfork Academy here, back with another Unreal Engine 5 tutorial, and in today's video, I'm going to show you how to create this really cool Niagara particle system for falling leaves for the trees in your game. I'll also be showing you how to create a custom texture to use for the leaf particle itself, based on the texture of the leaves from your tree material. But before we get started, I'd like to invite everyone to join our free and public Discord server, the Pitchfork Academy. It's a great place to connect with like-minded individuals, share some of your work, and maybe even get some help. If you'd like to join us, the invite link is in the description and in the pinned comment. Now let's get into the tutorial. Alright guys, here we are in Unreal Engine 5.6, and as you can see, I already have a tree set up here. This is actually from my previous tutorial on how to set up and create a soft, stylized foliage leaf shader. For example, here you can see this shading on the tree is very soft and fluffy, compared to more traditional shading where the lighting might look a little bit more harsh, even though it might be more realistic. So this is the starting point that I'm going to use, but of course you can use any tree or style that you have to follow along with this, as we're just going to be making the particle system that has the falling leaves. All right away we can actually just go ahead and create the Niagara system, but first I'll make a folder for Niagara. So right click, new folder, and then call this Niagara. And then inside of here, I'll just right click anywhere and go to Niagara system and just click that. There's a ton of preset options here. I do recommend, if you're interested in VFX and want to learn more about them, to just try all of these and see what you can come up with. They all have different starting points that are sort of tweaked to be what they say in the name. For example, we're going to be using the blowing particles here, but there's a fountain, which of course could be used for fire, or a fire hydrant maybe has exploded and there's water coming up from everywhere. Omnidirectional burst. There's a lot of cool stuff in here, but we're going to be using blowing particles. And as you'll notice here, just so you're aware, it does run on the GPU instead of the CPU. Some of these are the opposite. For example, the fountain runs on the CPU, but the newer method is to run on the GPU. So luckily this one's set up for that by default. Let's create the blowing particles system, and then I'll name it ns underscore leaf. And then right away, we can actually just click and drag it to the base of our tree, and I'll bring it up to maybe the middle. And as you can see here, the effect is already quite strong. The leaves are blowing in a specific direction. They're sort of going through the wind with some turbulence, and they're flipping around. But you'll notice some of them are flipping quite fast, so that's one thing that we'll be adjusting. And of course, the material that it's using isn't very nice for a leaf, so we'll be also looking at how to create a nice leaf material. The next step is just to open up our Niagara system, so I'll double click to open it, and right away we can see these two nodes. This is the overall specs of the node that you don't really need to mess with too much, and then this is the actual parameters of the particles themselves. For example, how many there are, their lifespan, their size, material, etc. So once you have this node selected, you'll see all of the properties on the right, and it's a very long list because it's giving us every parameter in each of these. So for example, if I were to click on wind force, it just shows me the wind force section. But if I were to select on the full node, we could scroll down and we'll find wind force eventually in this list. So there's wind force. So if you know exactly what you're trying to adjust, you can just click it here on the node itself, and then it'll give you that specific area, because it is a lot to go through. But we will just slowly go down the list. So spawn rate is the first thing that you might want to consider. I'll leave it at 15, which is the default for now, just so we can kind of see everything happening. But eventually you could maybe lower this or increase it depending on your game. And then we have lifetime mode. For leaves, I think it's nice to just have a direct number. So I'll do a direct set, and then the lifespan can be 20. From here, we can scroll down a little bit more, and we will find the sprite size mode. So this you can keep a little bit random. So for example, this will randomly choose between 4 and 8 for the size. For this video, I'll just make it 10 and 20 for now, so we can just see them a little bit bigger. We'll adjust that as we go and see how it looks on our specific trees. Again, this is going to very heavily depend on the size of the leaves on your tree, because you do want it to kind of match up with the scale. The next, we can find the shape. So down here, this is the shape in which they spawn. So as of right now, they're spawning within a big sphere, and the radius of that sphere is set here, so 300. If I were to set it to 10, you'll notice that the leaves spawn from this little bitty sphere here, and it kind of jets out from the left. If I set it to 500, it'll just be a much bigger sphere than we had before. And again, depending on your tree, you can adjust this sphere radius. So I'll set it to 500 just so they spawn a little bit farther out from each other. All right, we can keep scrolling down and we'll eventually find the wind. So the wind here, it's set wind speed 200 on the X, 0 on Y and Z. So if we just drag our particle system to the side, you can see here if I select the tree, the red arrow here is indicating the X orientation, and the green is the Y, and then the blue is the Z. So as of right now, since this arrow is going to the left, that's the positive direction of the x-axis. So the wind currently is showing 200 units in that way. If I set this to negative 200, the particles will just go the opposite direction because it's negative 200. And if I were then to add 200 on the y-axis, then they'll start to go up this way and towards this bottom right area now that I'm angled this way. So you can experiment with this depending maybe on the wind in your game. If you have a set direction, you'll want to adjust your wind speed to sort of line up with that so it's a little bit more realistic. I don't really recommend messing with the Z value because you'll get some wacky results. For example, if I set this to 1,000, the leaves will start blowing up into the sky. So just to give you an example of those different axes there. I'll set mine to just 200 and 200. So positive X and positive Y. Cool, looking pretty good. The next thing we can look at is that issue I mentioned earlier where some of these particles spin very fast and a little bit too much. So we'll just scroll down a little bit. I'll go back to full screen and we'll find the aerodynamic drag section. So again, this is one of these nodes here or these parameters. So if I click on aerodynamic drag, it just brings up that section. And we're looking at the rotation strength here. So we have minimum 1.8, maximum 3.2. I did quite a bit of experimenting, and in my opinion, you want to set this pretty low, and you can always increase it later, but I like to do a value of 0.05 and then 0.25. Now if we go back to our level, you can see the leaves are much more chill. Some of them are barely rotating at all. Some of them are doing the 0.25. And it's just more calm and not as jarring. Some of them before were really, really spinning rapidly, which I didn't think looked too realistic. If this doesn't look realistic enough to you, you can always increase the minimum from maybe 0.05 to 0.1 or 0.15, and then slightly increase the maximum. But I'll leave this for this tutorial. And then from here, we can look at the collision settings. So I'll just click on the collision box here. So now we see everything to deal with the collision. So by default, the collision type is set to GPU depth buffer, but there's an issue with this when you use masked materials or opaque materials. The reason that we still see these materials here or these particles is because they're using an additive blend mode, meaning that they're slightly transparent, but for a leaf, you don't really want it to be transparent. So if we change this to, for example, GPU distance fields, now we can use masked and opaque materials, which is the material type that we'll be creating in just a moment for the leaf themselves. So GPU distance fields is the way to go for leaves. So now that we've made that change to the collision, you'll notice that the leaves are sort of sticking around a little bit more and collecting in crevices and things, and that's actually quite nice. But if it's a little too much, what you can do is go back to your particle root node and find the spawn rate. So what we can do now is just change this from 15 maybe down to 5. Of course, you can play with that number. And then lifetime, I might just half that, so I'll set it to 10. Remember the default before was like 12 and 16 or something like that, so 10 should be decent. Of course, these are all numbers that you can tweak to your project. Now it's a little bit more natural looking. So what we can do next is the final thing on the settings for this, and that's going to be the camera settings. So basically over time, or not over time, but over distance, we want the particles to not spawn. So if we search for camera and click enter, you can see here in the visibility section, this enable camera distance culling. So if I check this to be true, and then we'll leave it at the default of 1,000, and we go back to the level, you can see we don't even see the particles, but as we get closer, they start to spawn in. That's a little bit extreme. I might try something like 5,000. Whoops. 5,000, and then back here, we still see the leaves. And about right here, they start to fade away, which I think is a decent distance, especially if you're worried about performance. You don't want particles spawning super far away from the camera. It's just not necessary. It's really a nice effect when you're up close to the camera. So, all right, next we can look at creating the material for the leaf itself. So when it comes to creating the actual material or texture that we'll use for the leaf's silhouette on the particle, for example, we don't just want a pure sphere, we want it to be the shape of a leaf. There's a couple ways you can do it. The fastest way is probably going to be going to Google and maybe Google searching for an opacity mask. So for example, here I search leaf opacity mask, and there's quite a few here. But the problem with this is they might not always match the style of your tree. They're probably not in a power of 2. For example, this is 1593 by 1600, and in game engines, especially Unreal, you want the textures to be in a power of 2. So you'd have to resize it, and then you'd also have to make sure that it's a free to use texture. You don't want to, of course, use any texture that's not free to use and maybe has a license. So you could go through all of that trouble, or maybe if you're just doing a quick test, this would be a good route to take. But if you don't want to do that, you can go to Photopea. This is a free Photoshop editing website. You can actually edit things right here in the browser. If you don't have Photoshop, this is a free to use version of Photoshop. I have it downloaded as a program. So for example, I can just open up Photopea, and here it is as well. And what we're going to do actually is go back to the engine. So if we go to the tree material and I double click on the instance and I find the texture that's powering the silhouette of my tree material here, and I browse to that, I just want to export this. So I'll right click and go to Asset Actions and Export. And I'll just save it to my desktop. That's fine. So I'll save it there. And then I do happen to know that this is an 8K texture. It's pretty big. It's probably overkill, but remember, this is a Megascan pack that I started with. So it is what it is. And what I'll do now is just open up that texture. So I'm just on my other monitor looking for my texture really quickly. And let's see if I open it up. Cool. So as you can see here, it's 8K texture. We don't want to bring that straight into Photopea. It'll take forever to load and edit. So what I'll do is click on the little 3 dots here, and I'll resize the image. And I'll just bring it down to 1024. Even this might be a little bit overkill. You could probably go 512, 256. But just for this tutorial, I'll keep it there. And then I'll just do underscore 1024 at the end with the new name and save it. Cool, so it saved it there. Now if I go back to open Photopea and then find my new texture, I'll just drag in my 1024 texture into here. And then now we have the 1024 version of that texture that's powering our leaves. Now the goal is just to find a nice leaf area on here that we want to use for all of the leaf particles. So if I hold Alt and scroll in, we can zoom in maybe on this leaf here. That's pretty nice. You could also maybe do a 3-piece leaf like this. I'm going to go with the single leaf route. So there's a couple different ways you could do this. You could draw and cut this leaf out, but what I'm going to do is just rotate this image around, and then I'm going to zoom way out and scale the image way up. And I'll just drag until I find it. This is just a quick way to do it. Maybe it's not the best way, but this will work. Just click and drag until we find the leaf. There it is. Zoom back in. And you'll notice that this has all the other information still. It's not just the opacity mask. We're still getting the roughness and transparency mask. So if you're going for a more of a realistic leaf look, you'll still have access to those textures as well. And if you wanted to do this with your albedo map or normal map, you would just bring those in as well and scale them all at the same time and export them separately. But this is just a quick way to go with the stylized tree shading that we have going. So I'll just confirm this here, and this should be good to go. All right, now we can go ahead and export this. So I'll export as PNG. And I'll call this at the end leaf. So 1024 leaf. Now we have that. I'll just close out of this and then browse to my image. So I have it here on my other monitor to drag into the engine in a second. I can go ahead and minimize Photopea. And then what you can do now is just wherever you have your other textures for your tree, you could add it there. So I'll just add it right next to these other ones. So now we have the leaf texture that we use for the entire tree, and then the one that we're going to use for our particle. And again, this should have the same textures as the other one. So now we have that, and we can go now back to our content browser. And then I already have a materials folder. You can go ahead and create your own if you don't already. So I'll go into here, and then again, this is my foliage folder where I have the tree material, and I'll make a new folder now, and I'll call this Niagara. And inside of here, right click, make a new material, and I'll call it M underscore leaf underscore NS for Niagara system, and then double click to open that up. And then the first things that we need to do on the left is change our blend mode from opaque to masked, because we're going to use that opacity mask, and the shading model from default lit to two-sided foliage, and then check two-sided to be true. And then you can scroll down even more until you find the usage section. And we want to check things that are having to do with particles. So I'll check used with particle sprites, used with mesh particles in case you're using it on a mesh, and used with Niagara sprites. So now that those are all checked, it should work with most particle systems. Next, we can begin to add some nodes. The first one I'll do is a color parameter. So I'll hold V on my keyboard, the letter V, and that'll give us a vector parameter. And I'll call this color. Default color I'll set to be the color of the tree that we have in the level, which is just sort of a white or really light pink, and that'll be good for that. And then we can now go back to our texture that we brought in. So here's our texture, and I'm just going to browse to it, and then I'll go back to my material and click and drag this into here. And then we have our color. So the color is going to go into base color. Again, if you did also make the albedo map for this texture, for example, if you also brought and again, you could also use the albedo texture. We didn't edit that in Photopea, but you could also take this texture and the normal map into Photopea and scale them and create those masks as well, in addition to this mask that we made. But for our tree, we just need the opacity mask. So we're just using this texture. And we do know that the opacity mask is in the R channel. Your texture might be different. You got to check and just look at all the different channels and see where the black and white silhouette is. So it's on the R. So our R goes into opacity mask. And we also want to put the color into subsurface color. That's important, so that way the light that shines through the other side is the same color of the leaf. And that should be good for now. Oh, I do want to set the specular to be how I have it in my other material. I'll set it to be 0.1. This just makes it not reflect as much light, and it in turn makes the color more vibrant. It's what I do in my recent tutorial for the leaf shading as well, just to make the color pop a little bit more. Now we can go ahead and we'll do one last thing, and that's to, convert our texture sample to a parameter. So I'll call this leaf mask. And now we're good to save. Once it saves, we can now make a material instance of our new material. So I'll just right click, create material instance, and I'll call this mi underscore leaf underscore ns underscore white. And then inside of here, we'll just open it up. And if you wanted to then change things like the color, you could do that here, but we're going to leave it at this color for now. And now if we go back to our Niagara system, we want to, at the very bottom, we see sprite renderer. So I'll click on that, and then we have our material here. So from this drop down, I can search for leaf underscore ns, and we'll find our material instance leaf white. Click that. And then in the preview, you can already see it's using the new texture. And now if we go look at a particle up close, you can see it is the leaf shape. So that's looking pretty awesome. And if you wanted to tweak the color to match more of the tree, of course, you would do that in your material instance if you wanted to make it more pink or whatever color that you're going for. All right, guys, now if we right click anywhere and click play from here, we'll be able to spawn, click F11 to go full screen. And we can see these really nice falling leaves coming right towards us. It looks really awesome. Again, the direction and the speed is based on that wind parameter that we set. Remember, we set it to be 200 value on the X and 200 on the Y. If it's a little bit too far or fast for you, what you can do is go back to the Niagara system, and I'll just make that change really quick. So if I click on the system here, oh, and then I just go to wind force, we can see somewhere, oh, up here, wind speed, 200 and 200. I'll set it to be half that, 100 and 100. compile and save. Then we'll minimize. And now if I play full screen, and now they're falling more straight down, but also still having some wind go to the side. I think that looks really, really nice. So one last thing that you might want to adjust based on your specific trees is the scale of the particle. Earlier, we set it to a specific value. I think we did 10 and 20. So if I highlight the node here and scroll down, oh, I guess scroll to the top first, and then down a little bit until we find sprite attributes and then the uniform sprite size min and max. I did 10 and 20. I might lower it to 8 and 16 and see how that looks. Because I did notice that the leaves on this specific tree are a little bit smaller. So we want the particles to match that as close as possible. And right away I can tell that they look a little bit more in line with the scale of the leaves themselves. So depending on your tree, you'll want to adjust that. And also another thing about Niagara systems is I don't believe there's a way yet to create an instance of this. So for example, if I right click, there's no create Niagara instance, for example. So once you have the particle system set up how you like, you'll want to duplicate it and adjust things, maybe like the scale or the material or the amount of particles that spawn, things like that, that you would want to change on a per tree basis. All right, guys, that's going to do it for this tutorial on how to create a Niagara particle system for falling leaves and has a custom texture that matches the leaves on your tree to make it all line up and look quite nice. If you guys learned anything at all or enjoyed the video, it'd mean a lot if you left a like and subscribe to our channel, as it lets us know that you want to see more tutorials like this one. This has been Vylocity with Pitchfork Academy, and I'll see you in the next one.